This is your World War III update. We're going to do a quick cursory overview of the events of the day as they've unfolded since my conversation with Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis. You may or may not have watched that video earlier today, but we actually did that interview during the Geneva talks between the Iranian and American delegations, and a lot has transpired since that time. So I want to give you guys a breakdown of what is going on. This is just my opinion, but quite frankly, it is probably the best one you're going to get on the internet with respect to this particular issue. Now, needless to say, a lot of inauspicious signals coming out of Geneva. It was not good at all. In fact, it was very, very bad. I think that any time now from this point forward, war could break out. Because the Iranians, and here's what everybody and every analyst is going to miss. The Iranians, because they're the defenders, they need to placate their population. For two reasons, they have to always have the rose-colored glasses on and always be optimistic when presenting their appraisal of these conversations as they're ongoing. So the Iranians claim that the talks have progressed from establishing a mere framework for negotiations to actual technical talks, which should be initiated next week, they claim. But I'm going to tell you why you shouldn't believe this. Two main reasons, all right? The first reason is because, and it's a simple one, it's that when they do get attacked by the Americans, they can at least say they tried. They won't be the ones who can be construed as being intransigent and unwavering in their demands, because they, of course, were being very positive in their appraisal. Whereas if the Americans are coming off and they're saying, no, the Iranians are being stubborn and obstinate and they're not willing to cooperate and they're not willing to effectively meet our demands, and then they attack, well, that kind of looks bad for them. But at the same time, at this point in time, I don't think anybody cares about their social credit score when it comes to moral imperatives and things of that nature. So the main reason why Iran has to pretend as though the talks are going well is to placate their population and to ensure that they minimize panic, because the last thing you want is people panic buying at the stores, panic buying at the gas pumps, clogging up the corridors, impeding military movements, because they know full well that from this point forward, an attack could come. And it's very likely that it's going to come under the cover of commercial airliners that are still flying around. Unless Iran is notified in advance that this is going to come, which I can't see happening, because of course the element of surprise is going to be absolutely essential. If this is a decapitation strike attempt, that means that there's still going to be commercial jetliners in the air. So just like we've seen during the 12-day war, I'm pretty sure that one was started while there were still civilians flying around in planes. Now that creates huge problems for the Iranian air defense, because they don't want to have a situation like they had back in early 2020, late 2019, where after the Soleimani assassination, they actually shot down a commercial jetliner because they thought it was a military plane. That absolutely could happen in this instance. Now, what you might see happen is maybe the U.S. tips off some of the airlines, but that, of course, would blow the cover and it would tip off the Iranians. They would likely find out. They would know that an attack was imminent. Mainly, the reason why the Iranians have to talk about these conversations as if they're going very well is because they may have to declare martial law and fight back. And of course, if you have a bunch of panicked people running around everywhere, well, that's going to complicate things until the attack happens. And the last thing you want to do is kick a hornet's nest that is the Iranian population right now, that is on the brink of revolting once again. They were able to suppress it, but there's nothing to say that that couldn't flare up again. And you don't want to give them reason to in the form of an anti-war protest, right? So that's my take on why the Iranians are presenting this situation in much better terms than it actually is. Now, the Americans, of course, because they're going to be on the offensive end of things, they want to frame the Iranians as being the ones who are being uncooperative. So it's in their vested interest for Steve Jerkoff and Jared Kushner to come away from these conversations and say things like, well, we don't think that the Iranians are wavering on any issue. They don't seem to be receptive. They don't seem to be willing to alter their positions at all. And that's exactly what they did. Okay, so that divergence right there is absolute proof, in my mind, beyond all of the myriad other data points that I enumerated yesterday. That is the nail in the coffin. Okay, this is a done deal. Think about this. These are the demands that the U.S. delegation was making. Destroy all 3 nuclear sites, Fordow, Natanz, Isfahan. That's never going to happen. Deliver all enriched uranium to the U.S. So they're adding insult to injury. Before, there was possibility of sending that enriched uranium to Russia, even though the Iranians would never agree to that. So that one is DOA as well. No sunset clauses, meaning this would be indefinite. Really, at the end of the day, that doesn't matter because war is war. I mean, it's a piece of paper. These written agreements and international laws, they're only binding insofar as both sides are willing to abide by them. Zero enrichment, but Iran can keep their reactor. Minimal sanctions relief up front. More if Iran is compliant. So Iran essentially said that we don't agree to this, okay? But of course, they wrap it in very euphemistic language so that their own population can be mollified to a degree, and hopefully for a few more days anyways, keep calm and keep the grocery stores full, because that's the last thing you need is a bunch of people trying to bug out of the cities at the same time when you're trying to move around air defense and shit's going haywire. So if they can postpone that as long as possible, because they've decided not to impose martial law for the longest time, which I think should have been the case, at least to a certain degree, that's the reality of the situation. Although every country has a different way, I suppose, of imposing martial law. It doesn't always necessarily have to mean curfews and things of that nature. It just could mean a much more vigilant, militant presence in the streets. So Iran has warned, and Daniel Davis emphasized this point today, that they would treat even a limited U.S. strike as a trigger for an all-out response. Now, this is very essential to understand, because they must presume that anything that's going to happen at this point, especially with all that firepower in the region, that they're going to use it. They're going to use it all. So it's very unlikely that the first salvo is going to be the last. So for the Iranians, they need to go all out when the shit hits the fan. And this, of course, means that they'll target all U.S. military bases in the region, presumably. They will use all their naval assets, submarines and underwater drones and aerial drones and hypersonic missiles and things of that nature to take out or attempt to take out U.S. naval forces and deplete their air defense. They will attempt to counter the suppression of enemy air defense systems with the F-35s and the Growlers and things of that nature in order to maintain some parity of aviational capability. But it's going to be an all-out bloodbath, man. It's going to be absolute chaos. And I'm still shocked that there are some analysts out there who think that nothing is going to happen. It's a very bold call. I'm going to be talking to Ray McGovern tomorrow. He doesn't think things are going to happen, but I think at this point it's either just hedging their bets or just entrenching themselves into a position which becomes more and more untenable by the day. We have U.S. military airlift to the Middle East nonstop. Okay, just nonstop. While these talks are going, after these talks are going, we got a war with Pakistan and Afghanistan that flared up today. They took out the top guy in the Taliban. Apparently, the Taliban said that they were going to support the IRGC. Okay. And so Pakistan takes them out. Pakistan has a nuclear pact with Saudi Arabia. You start to see how all of these pieces fit together. So ostensibly then, the Iranian position just got weaker today by virtue of the Taliban chief being defeated, although I'm not really sure that's a allegiance that you can set your watch to. So in addition to that, we have Qatar canceling flights until June. We have J.D. Vance commenting that don't worry, bro, it's not going to be a war that's going to be fought for years or indefinitely. It's just going to be, a little itty bitty war, right? He didn't really say that last part, but you got to understand the language. He distinctly said that it's not going to be a war that lasts many years. Well, a war that lasts many months nowadays is a big deal when you've amassed such firepower. And the precedent you set is to do these huge, big arrow, bolt out of the blue maneuvers where it's a lot of firepower, it's a lot of shock and awe, a lot can go wrong in a very short period of time. Everything is speeding up, not just technology, not just the singularity in a digital sense, but also in a kinetic one. And the same thing is true with the kill chain and the escalation ladder in war, with these types of wars. Thank God Vladimir Putin has the patience of a Buddhist monk, and despite having many of his critical infrastructural facilities targeted today, he persists in not pushing that nuclear button. But remember what he said a few days ago: if Ukraine gets a nuclear weapon, and if we see French and English troops in there, we may well have to do that. I digress. J.D. Vance made that comment today. I would encourage people to go and watch the clip where he basically says that don't worry, we're not going to be getting, ensnared in a couple years war. Well, really, what does that mean? I mean, once you're in the war, then they're going to move the goalposts once again. So we already kind of created the standard that, well, we may enter a war. It just might not be a long one. Okay, so they're going to go to war. It's probably going to be several months. And then, of course, because of the mission creep aspect of this, they'll be able to say, well, now that we're in here, we're just going to have to keep going. And then you get into the whole MIC, sunk cost fallacy, where you just, it's a bottomless pit. And once you're in that, it's very hard for military, manufacturing companies and their shareholders to want to relinquish that sort of cash cow. So apparently Iran brought down a drone, an MQ-4C recon drone, possibly using electronic warfare. Not entirely confirmed, but that is from an American defense news source. So it looks like there has been something, and it was actually a couple days ago, so that could have been the first interaction of the new conflict. Apparently, all Persian language news and political channels on the Yaset satellite. This is a UAE-based communication satellite widely used across the Middle East. They appear to be off-air based on a photo sent to us. This outage, the reason for it's not clear. Was this a cyber attack by the Iranians? Because, of course, if this is being broadcast out in Persian, then it could be that whatever very Western-skewed message is trying to be delivered across those airwaves, the Iranians don't want to be delivered. This one is fascinating. The cost of shipping oil from the Middle East is skyrocketing. The cost of shipping 2 million barrels of crude from the Middle East to China is up to $200,000 per day for one of these massive shipping tankers. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, oh, well, that's probably what is the normal? 150,000, 175,000. That is a 584% increase since the first week of January. Okay? Since the first week of January, we have nearly a six-fold increase in the cost of shipping crude. And look at the price of oil, how subdued it is. Now, this actually makes sense because you have the Saudis and the Iranians using every means they can to get as much oil as they can out of their country before the shooting starts. I didn't show you the chart yesterday, but I told you that the amount of exports from Iran and Saudi Arabia are up 3x in the last month. 3x. So the Iranians are trying to offload as much oil as they can onto tankers. And so that means that there's less tankers out there, but there's potentially more oil on the market. So you have a glut, but you also have a paucity in oil tankers now. So that creates, of course, higher prices for shipping, but potentially lower costs for oil, even though, the risk premium is factored in. It's just being suppressed by the glut of the amount of oil that's currently on the water. Okay, so this is a huge tell that something big is going down. And this is a way that they, I guess, even if unintentionally, can keep the price of oil a little bit suppressed, because all of this oil is being rushed off to sea. So everybody has access to it at the same time. And if you want to sell it right now, of course, you're going to have to sell it. There's going to be a lower bid for it because, of course, there's so much oil going around. So that's what's going on. There's a lot more going on in the Middle East than just that, but just know that the United States, because they're the offenders, they have a vested interest in making the Iranians look intransigent and unwilling to come to the table or unwilling to make any changes. And that's all these was a list of demands. And even if they were to meet those demands, they would move the goalpost once again, as Marco Rubio stated yesterday, that they have to relinquish control of their long and short range missiles, which will never, ever, ever happen. All right. So they're just kicking the can down the road. There's going to be a big strike. It could even happen on Friday. Donald Trump tweeted out something very cryptic. He said it was the White House who tweeted it out, and it showed a picture of him. And it said Friday's coming or Friday's happening soon. It was just a weird, close up of his face. And it was with the caption, always winning, or we keep winning, or something like that. So Friday, as many people have caught on, is usually the day when they commence these things after the markets close, because they don't want to spook the markets. And because we're so fickle, and because we've been trained on these short reels and TikTok videos, we have the attention span of a flea, and they know that if they start World War III on Saturday, by Monday, the markets will just forget about it, right? So that's what I think he was hinting at. So things could go down this weekend. And of course, that would be in line with his recent 10-day ultimatum that he gave to Iran. And if you recall, last year, it was pretty much on the day. I think he had given Iran a 60-day ultimatum, and he was a man of his word in that instance. But I think it might have came one day or so before, even though they had said that, well, we're going to do one more round of talks next week. So, it could just be, sometimes you get bored when you're at that level and you just want to mess with people, which is why all the Illuminati symbolism in movies, because when you're the elites, you get bored. So you kind of want to play with your food, right? So let's move over to Europe. Viktor Orban said some crazy shit today. I mean, I could do videos on every one of these talking points, but get a load of this. Hungary reveals that Europe is going to war with Russia in 1 to 2 years. That's the caption. Now, he said, because Hungary is going to have an election, I think in April 9th, if I'm not mistaken. And that's a big one because, of course, right now they are in the middle of a fight with Ukraine over Ukraine allowing oil to flow through the Druzhba pipeline, which flows through their country, which the contract ended. I think it ended in January of 2025. But the Russians, of course, for obvious reasons, I mean, people were baffled for the longest time as to how it's possible that Ukraine is allowing Russian oil to ship. Well, obviously, NATO countries have vested interest. They need that oil, which is why that critical infrastructure was left alone, even though it was funding Russia's side of the deal. So anyways, Hungary has basically threatened to cut off all electricity, as well as Slovakia, to Ukraine unless they open the spigots once again and allow the cheap oil from Russia to flow. Iran has said, fuck you. In fact, they've even blown up one of the pumping stations for the Druzhba pipeline. Massive explosion that I showed you a couple days ago. Now, here's what Orban says today. Are you ready for this? He says, this will be, and remember when Alexander Vučić, the president of Serbia, he said this year was going to be worse than last year, and next year is going to be worse than this year. He's the biggest black pill doomer, even worse than me. And here's what Orban has to say. This is going to be the last election before Europe goes to war with Russia. He is saying that he has news that the French and the British will send 2 brigades to Ukraine. Now, look, I'm sure the Western intelligence agencies are going to try to withhold information from some of these second-tier countries in Europe. but you can't hide everything. And in fact, this is something that's been in the works since early 2024 when they first started talking about deploying troops. In fact, I broke that story. I was the first one to talk about that back in early 2024, back when they were doing the big Steadfast Defender operation. Anyways, French and British troops, I think they're going to be a couple brigades. They're going to hang in the back, so they're not going to be on the front lines to start. But of course, mission creep, right? Mission creep. So that means that first it's one brigade, then it's two, then you're at war with Russia. And this is why, and this is crazier, Warsaw is stockpiling underground shelters, but not just shelters, subways. All right, so the Warsaw mayor, there's a video of this. He's walking through the subway and he's showing emergency supplies pre-placed throughout this subway. Emergency storage facilities are being set up in the Warsaw subway in case of crisis situations. The mayor presented the equipment already stockpiled: mess kits, thermoses, canteens, sleeping bags, stretchers, and field beds. The city has also begun purchasing power generators. Thousands of units of various equipment are planned, and this is only the beginning of the preparations. Poland, of course, has one of the biggest militaries in Europe. They've been preparing for this for a long time. And so it's only a matter of time before they get involved, probably in the Suwalki corridor in and around Kaliningrad, something like that. Of course, the Baltic states are also going to get small contingents of troops. They're slowly trickling in. They're supposed to be getting a couple full brigades of German troops, which probably doesn't mean much numerically in terms of the numbers of the conflict that you're seeing there, if we believe the official counts from either side. But things are definitely heating up in Europe as well. In fact, a Russian drone approached the French aircraft carrier Charles de Gaulle while it was docked in Malmo. I believe that is somewhere outside Denmark. And apparently it didn't go so well for the Russian drone. So Russia completely lit up Ukraine last night. I mean, lit up. Just covered the map with the drone trajectories. And Ukraine responded. They hit a chemical factory. They hit another Lukoil facility. I believe it was in Luhansk. And so they've been getting some real big optical wins. But apparently a Russian drone could have been brought down by a French aircraft carrier, which in and of itself is a fairly major escalation. Now, there was apparently a simulation that was done by some researchers, an AI war game, and they gave the AI the ability to utilize nuclear weapons. And what do you think happened? Well, they escalated to nuclear use quite fast. We're dealing with the most objectivist of objectivists here. There's going to be no hang-ups and reluctances about what could potentially go wrong. No unsubstantiated fears as there might be with humans. Well, for good reason there are fears surrounding nuclear weapons, but there was an AI war game which leveraged all of the top LLMs, including, of course, Anthropic, OpenAI, and Gemini, and reportedly escalated towards the use of nuclear strikes and often leveraged deception far more than expected. So they're teaching these things to deceive and trick people. In fact, Anthropic, I believe, wasn't it recently used? It was jailbroken and used to hack like the Mexican government. So, I mean, that's just a jailbroken version. All right. Imagine what these guys really have. Speaking about Anthropic and how this ties into Skynet, they have rejected the Pentagon's best and final offer, they claim, less than 24 hours before the United States Secretary of War, his 5 p.m. deadline for them to relinquish control and remove the guardrails. Now, I think this is a bit of a publicity stunt because a lot of people didn't even know about Anthropic before this. You know, everybody knows OpenAI. I mean, I've known Anthropic for about a year or so. I've been familiar with the name. I don't really use Claude that much. But it does seem kind of weird because Anthropic has always been the one touted as the humanitarian version that doesn't get used for war. And it's almost like this whole spectacle, they're trying to paint it as that. So it's a Trojan horse. It's another Elon Musk. It's another Cybertruck, you know. So I wouldn't really buy this. all these guys. And if this was a real national security issue, you wouldn't hear a damn thing about it. They would take that nerd into the back room and they would make him sing like a canary. There would be absolutely no two ways about it. He would have a gag order. There would be NDA. They would just, you would not hear about this story if it was actually a national security risk. So this is just, we're wrestling for the public, essentially. So that's what's going down, my friends, and a lot more. But I got to wrap it up there. I got to talk with former CIA analyst Ray McGovern. Tomorrow, I would encourage you to go check out the interview with Dan Davies. Lieutenant Colonel Dan Davies did 21 years, served in Afghanistan and Iraq. I think 2 tours, both in, I think it was Desert Storm and the Operation Iraqi Freedom or whatever bullshit they called it. But he has a perspective of somebody who's been on the ground and fought the war. We talked a little bit about the prospect of a ground invasion. He has some unique things to say in that respect. But go check it out. It's a shorter one of our interviews. As far as our interviews go, it was only about 45 minutes. And I'll post a link in the description below. Thanks for watching. See you tomorrow.